What is the consonant? Please definition.
A consonant, male sounding consonant, such a letter which can be sounded with the help of a vowel. All the letter of the English language speed the vowel are called consonants.
For example, मिसाल मिसाल दो.
So A B C.
ABC हो गया.
Hi, my name is Ajay Pinjani. In my journey, I have experienced the power of stories, and I have realized that there are many stories around us. Today, I would like to share with you 3 stories which have tremendously influenced my own journey. The first story is about a 12-year-old youth who used to live in Swat. And Swat is in the northern part of Pakistan, and he was a school-going child. And one day, and at a point in time, there was an incident and there was an insurgency due to which the entire family, and not only his family, but many families had to migrate, and they had to be displaced to cities like Karachi. I was working with an organization where I was volunteering, and we were doing a summer camp, and I met that child over there. We didn't exchange names. We met, we played snakes and ladders, we played different games, and the first day, the second day, the third day, the day came where he had to depart and I had to leave. And at that time, he shook my hands and he asked my name. And I said, my name is Ajay. And he was shocked. Ajay is clearly a Hindu name. We've watched Bollywood films and we know that, Ajay is clearly a Hindu name. And the child was just confused. He was unable to fathom that if I know a person, how could this familiar person be somebody whose faith is not familiar to me? And you know what he said to me? He told me that it's impossible, you're a Muslim. And he was a Muslim like any other child in that particular community and never met a Hindu child or a Hindu adult. And to his confusion, he remarked further and he said, can you say this particular verse? And I repeated the verse. And this verse was from the religion which he proclaimed. And he shouted that you have converted. And I was really surprised. Because it did not make sense. And then when we met, and he knew that I had not converted. He just knew that. When I left, he did shake my hand, he did hug me, he did smile, we did exchange smiles. And that story really taught me about what we learn, how difficult it is to unlearn, or how easy, depending on how we react or respond to situations. Let me tell you a second story. And this story aligns a lot with the work I do. This story is when I was studying in India. I was a student who was the first Pakistani student to study in the university in India as a Pakistani. And because I was studying Masters in Social Work, I was doing field work in prisons. And one of them was an observation home. This observation home was particularly in the center city of Bombay, and this observation home was where children are kept for observation purposes. They are picked up from streets so that the state can become their guardian when they don't have their guardian. They could be those who are in child labor, they could be those who are accused of begging, or they could be those who are wandering around for certain aspirations of their own and they have left their families. Now when these kids, there were around 400 of these kids in that particular observation home. What was remarkable is that in the entire month I worked there, in the first month, I reckoned that nobody took their names. Their names were 1, 5, 7, 10, 14. And something which was much more unimaginable was when I stood outside this observation home, the gate said observation home, but when you ask people around that particular community who have been living there for a long time, where is the observation home? They would have staring faces, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. And then when I'll talk about the context and they'll say, oh, bachcho ka jail, oh, you're talking about a prison where the kids are. You're talking about prisoners of this particular age. One day we did an experiment, me and my colleague, and we thought more than an experiment, it was something we wanted to understand. And because our job was to build trust, and to build trust, you have to be with them. So what we did was, it was something minimal. We sat there in their prisons, because it was a British time prison, so the community was not wrong to say it was a prison, and they were sitting in their bars. There were hundreds of kids, and we sat with them and we asked one child that, can we have food with you? And he was surprised. He offered, but also cried. And at the same time, in the next 5 minutes, we saw 50, 60, all those kids lining up, asking us, "Hamari plate se bhi khana kha lein, can you please eat from our plate?" And to date, I wonder, what did they want? What do they want? Which part of identity in their own are they searching for? Which part of familiarity, which part of association are they belonging and longing for? And these two stories have really, really stayed with me and have made me come into education. Because I want to understand what is this education for, which creates such societies where children are left with such identities and such bewilderment. The third story is my own story. And I'll keep that brief. When I was in grade 6, 8, I failed, and I failed in subjects, but the label was much stronger. The label is always that you have failed, and that's the label we carry with ourselves, and that's the label I carried with myself. If my mother was not there, who told me from very childhood that happiness is within you, it would have been very difficult to sit here. It was unimaginable, but to sit anywhere was unimaginable. And when I was in university studying political science, I read about conflicts, read about nations and nationalism, read about peace and conflict, and at the same time, for the first time, I Googled the term education. And what I found was very surprising. What I found was there was a term, a Latin term, educere, and educere basically means to bring forth from within. Now that was so surprising, because all my life before that, I thought that education was about receiving. It was about somebody giving to us, somebody from outside telling us what is this, the information, the attitude, the values, whatever that is. But it is external, and I had failed. And it is because of my family and because of my privilege I was able to come to a university. Otherwise, many children are unable to access that. But then I learned that it is not about that. It is about the environment. So that everyone has within them a capacity to grow, but they don't know. I didn't know. And it is to bring forth from within, which is the society's collective effort, to bring forth from within every child. And that's where the learning environment pulls in, and that's really the central part where all these stories connect, and I felt education is the medium to affect change. And I don't know what that change is. I don't know what that destination is, but I certainly know that it is a journey, and it is a profound journey which needs to be cherished in the now. And that's where 8 years of education landscape journey in Pakistan for me began. Today it has been 8 years. I have worked in several organizations. Certain moments have been so powerful because I've been very fortunate to travel across Pakistan, being a minority, yet being part of a class, a social status which gives me tremendous privilege to not rely on the basic facilities which are not given by the state to many. And that's the contradictions of an insider and outsider I've experienced. And that's what I'm finding today in the project I want to talk about. Today, I work with an organization which is named the Citizens Foundation. The Citizens Foundation is a very unique project. It started 25 years back. It started by 5 people who sat down together, who were concerned, and today labeled as philanthropists, but they were concerned citizens. And they saw a tremendous concern in the country. 25 years back, not much has changed in a lot of those concerns, but the figures may have, but tremendous stories have been impacted to date. They started with 5 schools. They started with the agenda, can we bring schools to children rather than children walking to the schools? So the agenda was simple. Have a school within a community. have a school where government is unable to access, where many a times private institutions are unable to access. Keep it free of cost, keep it with accessible for the community, have localized teachers, and what we see today is 250 plus thousand students. What we see today is 1600 plus schools, 12,000 teachers, 400 principals. And certainly what came about was three major areas. It was concern, hope, and trust. The concern was far-fetching. 25 million children out of school, 17 million children in school, however facing very difficult conditions to learn. What they went was towards community-based learning. With the 12,000 teachers intervening with communities, they had a lot of decisions to take and tremendously have worked on continuous improvement as a basic guiding principle and school leadership as a fundamental floor to pitch upon. Being the largest not-for-state education provider in Pakistan, the Citizens Foundation is found everywhere across the country, and that's remarkable. That's remarkable because the students and the teachers and the community represents the entire diversity and heterogeneity of the country. And when the organization had schools over there, one of the fundamental questions was about language. And which language should the students study in? Yes, the aspiration is for English. And in that aspiration, in that urge to fulfill that aspiration, many a times, many institutions have forgotten the journey the students experience because of that desired end. The Citizens Foundation was conscious about that and chose to go with a language which is rather familiar, if not the most familiar, and that was the national language, Urdu. However, it was always felt that this is not sufficient, this is not substantial, and there needs to be more research. There needs to be more research to understand what is best for students, not from a political perspective as language has often been driven, not from a social perspective, not from a parent perspective, not from a destination perspective, but from a child-centered perspective. And that's where in 2018 we sowed the seeds of a research. We created a team within the organization and we wanted to understand what is the role of language in education. We studied models of multilingualism outside, and that's where the term came up, mother tongue based multilingual education. UNESCO documents, World Bank documents are filled with this particular terminology. We wanted to understand what does it really mean? Why is mother tongue so important? What is that role? Because everyone speaks about English is very important, that is the aspiration language. I am speaking to you in English. I can connect with the larger audience, all of you in English. Certainly it is important. It gives us access to opportunities, to work, every aspect. So we wanted to understand what is our context. And when we studied about Pakistan, we found that there are 70 plus languages spoken. Why? Because there are 70 plus cultures. There are 70 plus cultural repertoires. There are 70 plus traditions. And they all contribute to the identity of every child, as we spoke about in the story earlier. That is the composition which makes that child. That is the composition which makes that cultural society possible. So how can we keep a fair balance? We don't miss on the culture, we don't miss on the identity, and we don't miss on the aspirations and opportunities and access. What is that way? Is it even possible? We started our research from a particular context which is one of the most challenging. It's in the southern part of Pakistan. It is called Tharparkar. It is a district within the province of Sindh. As a district, its Human Development Index is one of the lowest across the country and across the world. One of the major reasons is geographical isolation. It is a desert. It has around 3,600 villages, and out of these 3,600 villages, 2,400 approximately of them are hamlets, and they do not have access to electricity. Now, with no access to electricity and roads being constructed as a new phenomena in the last decade or so, the exposure to language or the exposure to other aspects which are connected to language and opportunities is also cut off. Now one can say that they are underprivileged or lesser served, but that's the fact, that this is also what builds their unique cultural repertoire, what builds their unique identity. And I wouldn't want to miss out on that opportunity of identifying them as just underprivileged or lesser served, because they have a unique identity which the world can benefit of, and if not, they certainly benefit from that. Now how do you sustain that particular emphasis of identity and also give them that identity which will benefit them to connect with the wider world, with yourself, with us, with everyone else as well? And that's where we found, what is the language context first? So the first question was, is it a 3-language context, a 2-language context, a 4-language context? And we found it's a 4-language context. Initially our research program was called 3-language framework. So as a centralized institution, many a times, I'm sure you have experienced, many a time sitting at the center, we look from the center. And we look as something is periphery and something is center. And that is problematic also, which I learned. Because there is no periphery, there is no center. Everyone who's sitting where they are, it is the center for them. So from that perspective, when we found it is a 4-language context, they have their local language, then they have a regional language, then they have a national language which they connect with across the country, and then they have an aspired English or an international language, or in 100 years if it changes to another language, they'll have another language. So it's a multilingual context, and we reckoned that across Pakistan, that is the case. Either it's a 3-language context or it's a 4-language context or more. Now in this situation, how do you see schooling? Can we visualize schooling and school language policy differently? And that's where we learned from research that schooling can also be divided into 3 stages. So the child comes to us at the age of 5. Often as a centralized institution, we open up a school with the donor management support, every other support, or with the government support, and we have a child entering us at the age of 5. At the age of 16 mostly, they have to leave our system, and then they have to go to college. And many a times as the Citizens Foundation itself, the colleges are not under their control. The colleges are government funded or private funded, and then the college medium of instruction may be largely English, which is the fact in Pakistan and maybe in your country too. And from there onwards, the university is largely in English, because all the opportunities and access to materials is in English. So we understand that's the destination point in terms of language. We have to also recognize what is the beginning point. Is the child coming empty-handed? Because that's what I thought of what education was. But when I learned education was educare, that basically means that the child has a lot within themselves. Until the age of 5, these 5 years are spent, let's see Tharparkar, are spent in a house with the mother, with the father, with a particular cultural repertoire, where the neighborhood is limited to that particular neighborhood, where market is limited to that market. And in that context, the familiar language is the major medium for anything. One of the authors, we had interviewed around 135 stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders beautifully said that, Ajay, recognize what is the zone of interaction of the student, the immediate zone of interaction, and then we'll talk about the future zone of interaction. The immediate zone of interaction at the age of 5 is their language and everything which is learnt about the culture in that particular language. And then when the child comes to the school is the unfamiliar aspect. So what I learnt also is that the difference between familiarity and unfamiliarity. The child whom I met who had come from Swat had disagreed or was surprised because I was unfamiliar. But he was a bit confused. Why? Because in those 3 days he had developed a familiarity with me. Yet he was unfamiliar. So his whole narrative about me was unfamiliar, yet his 3 days were profoundly familiar, and he was unable to figure out which label to match, which label not to match. And that's what really matters, that can we create a journey in the language ladder which goes from familiar to unfamiliar rather than directly into unfamiliar. Because in Pakistan, when we are trying to teach from unfamiliar language, there are 17 million children who are in school. We often talk about 25 million children out of school. What we realized in the research as well as in the repertoire available and accessible by World Bank, by United Nations, by all the documents you have read many, many times, it basically says that 17 million children inside schools are also not learning. They don't know their language, they don't know the national language, they don't know the international language. The school is failing, the child is failing, the society is failing collectively. It needs to be a red warning sign. And that's where we felt that we need to see from two angles. One is the utilities, the social utility, the academic utility, and the cognitive utility. We want these three utilities to be maximized and optimized for every child in Pakistan and worldwide. On the other hand, we felt that the schooling journey can be of three stages. The primary stage, where the child enters the school is an unfamiliar place, will become a lovely place, a familiar place, hopefully a new home. And then after grade 2, grade 3 till grade 6, we see a middle years phase where is the scope for transition, where we talk about linguistic transition, where we talk about academic transition. We talk about not start from Othello in the first day, we start from local authors like Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai, like any cultural author, and we transition to an author which is well represented in the worldwide as well, so that they are familiar with their own culture and the culture outside. And then when we talk about grades 6 to 8 and 8 onwards, that is where we talk about the aspiration, the connection, the zone of interaction stretched to the wider world, stretched to the imagination which we don't have right now and they have for themselves. And in this journey, we reckoned that it's like a bridge. In the primary years, in the early years, it's like a bridge, and students are trying to walk this bridge. And if it is a most unfamiliar language, it's not about English, it's most unfamiliar language in that particular context for students as well as for teachers. Both the teachers and the students fall down. And it's very difficult to lift back, and we see that as a dropout. And there's a particular author who has beautifully put it that it is a push out, it is not a dropout. It is a push out. It is a conscious or a subconscious, not an unconscious, a subconscious or a conscious push out. We can avoid that. Then there is a less familiar language and a most familiar language. I'm sure you've gathered it by now. If there is a most familiar language, the journey will be not necessarily familiar, but will be engaging, will be joyful, will be challenging, will require a lot of trust, will require a lot of care, like any other education system. But it will be something which is not compromising the now of the child, and yet also not compromising the future of the child. We know the future is uncertain, but we know the present is in our hands. How do you miss the present and try to attain a future which is not even visible? With COVID, we can see that right now. I'm sitting in front of you and doing a COVID video podcast. We don't know what the world is, we don't know what the future is, but that's what we learned. And right now, fortunately, the Citizens Foundation has developed a team, and we've got the third element of Citizens Foundation, which I said was trust. I did not emphasize a lot on that. So the first was concern, there is concern. The second was hope, and the hope is there as I speak about language, as I speak about school leadership experience in TCF, every other aspect. And the third one is trust, not only in your own will, but in the capacity which the world will offer to you, because we are on a track where we believe that the intentionality is very, very clear. And with that intentionality, what we hope to do is that have a few schools. Right now there are around 700 plus students experiencing a mother tongue based multilingual education program and in Tharparkar. We don't know if this is the best model. We really don't know. I don't know what best is, but I certainly know that this belief or this particular understanding that studying in a familiar language, studying in a familiar culture, not kicking out a culture to involve another culture, is something which will lead us to an unfolding which will be certainly profound. And that's what I want to invite you all towards. That join us together, and let's talk more about it. What happens in your country? What happens in your context? Do you have a heterogeneous context? And I would be surprised if there is none. And what kind of heterogeneity do you see? What kind of familiarity to an aspired unfamiliarity journey are you foreseeing? Can we work together on this? Because individually we can't. We are trying to do more public engagement. We are trying to write papers. We've got a report published on the website. We're trying to figure those things out. But I know we can't do alone, and I'm not worried about that. What I want to leave you with today is what I started with. There are stories, and we all have stories to tell. And our stories matter, and everyone else's story matter. These all students have a story. All these 25 million children, students who are outside school, all these 17 million children who are inside school, everyone has a story. Can we uplift and make their stories profound in the now and rely on the beauty of unfolding with trust and care and hope? I believe we can. I hope so you too. Thank you.
ढाटकी में एक चवणी आए त देश छॾे वेश छॾे पर आपरी ॿोली न छॾे।